Welcome to Fireside Gaming. Willem here again, and today we're reviewing the PlayStation game Koudelka. If you haven't heard of Koudelka, I can't say I blame you. This is a JRPG from 2000 that easily slid under the radar of many during its original release, myself included. I only stumbled upon the game when looking to get into the Shadow Heart series, which is itself a niche RPG series on the PS2. My interest in the Shadow Heart series was always from afar. I never owned any of the games during the heyday of the PS2, but learned about them later on. I ended up finding a copy of the first Shadow Hearts during a journey to my local retro game store a couple of years ago, and I'm still seeking out the other two games in the series. As such, I didn't jump right into it. Instead, I looked online to make sure that it really was the first game in the series. I'm typically a stickler for playing games in order, even those that may not have the strongest connections between them. That's when I stumbled on Koudelka, and knew I needed to play it first. The story of Koudelka focuses on a main character of the same name. She's a medium that's able to communicate with the dead via her psychic powers. This draws her to Nimeton, a former monastery turned into a mansion by a rich man named Patrick. Once entering Nimeton Mansion, Koudelka meets up with Edward Plunkett, who's an actual historical figure in real life, and has to fight off this incredibly creepy-looking werewolf-type monster. Koudelka saves Edward's life, and the two agree to work together during their stay at the mansion. Along the way, Koudelka and Edward run into the Bishop James. He's also at the mansion for his own reasons, and doesn't divulge much at first. With these three together, the full party is assembled. Just don't expect them to get along like the typical JRPG protagonist. They bicker and fight constantly.
Think about it!
Which makes sense considering the situation and how little they know about each other. As the story progresses, Koudelka and company meet several other interesting characters in the mansion. Among them are a ghost girl they have to save, a thief that Edward quickly dispatches.
Thieves can be exceedingly honest, you know? Still, he did try to kill us. For that. What did you do that for?
A 600-year-old monk, and Elaine. Elaine is the crux of this whole story. She's the ghost that called out to Koudelka and brought her to the mansion in the first place. She's also the former love interest of James. See, him and Patrick, the owner of the mansion, were both in love with Elaine during their college years. However, Elaine was a lady of high status, and James feared that he couldn't provide for her due to his lower status. As a result, he stepped back and let Patrick win Elaine's heart. That's all well and good, but Elaine ended up getting killed by bandits one night when Patrick wasn't around. In his grief, Patrick stole the Emigre document from the Vatican. It contains a spell to revive the dead. James was sent to recover this document and also wanted to check up on his friend at the same time. The problem with this revival spell is the requirements. It requires the lives of 200 people before it can work. This results in Patrick turning the mansion into a prison and unjustly killing loads of people. He's successful in reviving Elaine, but only her body. He also dies shortly after this, and Elaine's body is left cocooned inside a giant flower deep in the mansion. Elaine begs Koudelka and the group to kill her body, which they agree to do. This leads to a final battle that has players running away from Elaine's body before it takes on a monstrous form at the top of a bell tower. After defeating Monster Elaine, the game kinda just ends. There's a short cutscene afterwards with the group talking about what just happened and the sun rising over the ocean, but that's about it. It's strange for sure, but the abrupt nature of the end does match the overall feel of the game. Just think about it. The group was never saving the world or anything like that. Instead, they just brought an end to one unnatural paranormal event. In that regard, the lack of fanfare at the end of the game makes sense. So what exactly is Koudelka? I know I already said it's a JRPG, but it's not what you might think of at first. Instead of it being about starry-eyed youths out to save the world, Koudelka is much closer to a survival horror game mixed in with a tactical turn-based RPG. The survival horror elements come from the overall feel and play of the game outside of battles. Players travel through the mansion in the dead of night while solving puzzles and finding supplies, such as ammo and healing items. It definitely gives off some Resident Evil vibes in this department. When the battles do start up, it's clear this isn't your normal survival horror game. Players have to fight each battle in a small area split up into squares on a grid. The characters can move around on this grid to reposition themselves and also attack enemies. One of the more interesting aspects of the grid is that characters and enemies can't pass each other. That means that to get the enemies further in the back, players will have to make use of ranged attacks, like magic or guns, or defeat enemies blocking the way. The same also applies to enemies, which means players can leave magic casters in the back to protect them from harm. Keeping this in mind, both enemies and players can be pushed by attacks. This pushing back and forth makes for an extra layer of strategy in how players want to attack and position themselves. For example, players could stack characters in a line to avoid being pushed back, but then they're open to magic attacks, which spread from the character the spell was casted on to the characters in direct contact with each other. Another interesting mechanic in Koudelka is connected to its weapons. Weapons can actually break if used too often, which can leave players having to rely on their fist for battle. Luckily, the game is good about providing players with enough weapons that this isn't really a problem. Also, players will gain mastery levels with weapon types the more they use them. In turn, weapons of that type will be less likely to break when they are used by a character with better mastery with them. There are also weapons that don't break in Koudelka. That includes any ranged weapons, such as crossbows or guns. Even without breaking, they do have their drawbacks. The biggest of these is the limited amount of ammo in the game. Also, it's worth noting that players have to reload ranged weapons. That's not too bad when it can be done in between battles, but if the player has to do it during a battle, it's just one wasted turn for that character. Magic works much like weapons do in Koudelka. It can be leveled and players will need MP to make use of it. A lack of MP at the start of the game means magic is hard to rely on, but it gets easier to use as players level up and increase their MP pools. Leveling up in Koudelka is also different from the normal JRPG. Instead of just getting stat boost randomly, players are given 4 points each level to put where they want. I love when games give me this option. It lets me really mold each character into what I want, and I'm all about that customization. For example, I focused Edward on melee weapons and sent him to the front lines. To help with that, I also boosted his vitality and strength. This let him deal more damage and take more hits at the same time. In James's case, I equipped him with guns and left him in the back. James already starts with High Piety, which gives additional mana and increases magic resist, so I didn't often have to worry about magic hitting the back line majorly affecting him, and he served as a great out-of-battle healer. Then there's Koudelka. She was my mage for the game, and let me just say that magic is dang effective. Granted, I literally maxed out her magic stat by the end of the game, but she was dealing tons of damage much earlier than that. Unfortunately, she was also a bit of a glass cannon with low vitality, which meant any physical and ranged attacks were deadly to her. This setup worked great for me, but it might not for others. If I ever play this game again, I might mix it up with completely different builds. That option is great for players like me that enjoy tinkering with leveling systems and adds replayability to the game. Let's move on to what else Koudelka has to offer players. This is a PS1 game, which means the graphics aren't the best. Some of the textures don't look that grand anymore, but others are still solid. The fixed camera angles might bother some people, but I don't find them to be a problem. Also, the game has loads of pre-rendered cutscenes. This game only takes about 12 hours to beat, but is spread across 4 discs. Part of that is due to these cutscenes, but audio also plays a big part too. It may come as a surprise to some, but Koudelka is a fully voiced PS1 game. Every scene in the game, whether it's pre-rendered or not, has voice acting. I'm not going to say it's the best voice acting there is. In fact, I'd go so far as to say most of it is bad, but it is there. With its horror inspiration, Koudelka doesn't offer much in the way of music. There's only 4 pieces that I can think of off the top of my head: the opening theme, battle theme, boss battle music, and credits roll. That's not to say this is bad. I found the battle music in particular to be quite enjoyable. But it also doesn't feel fit for fisticuffs either. Instead, it sounds more like the theme of a desert town or something. Normally I'd complain about the lack of music in a game, but not this time. It makes traversing the halls of the Nemeton Monastery eerie, and that fits with the rest of the game. Alright, now let's wrap up this review. Would I say Koudelka is a great game? No, not really. It has some flaws for sure, but none that go so far as to make it a bad game. Instead, it's a good game that is worth checking out. The unique blend of horror and tactical RPG alone makes it something that fans of either genre should give a look. So what's the best way to play Koudelka today? That's where things get tricky. Simply put, the game isn't easily accessible right now. Used copies are going for a pretty penny online, and there's no other release but the PS1 version. I was initially holding out for a PC version of the game before playing it. A publisher called Console Classics was originally planning to put out a version of Koudelka on Steam, but that doesn't seem likely. That publisher hasn't posted on social media since 2015, and none of their game releases on Steam are after that date either. At this point, players that want to check out Koudelka will just have to get creative. Of course, I plan to check out the rest of the Shadow Hearts series in the future, but I can't say for sure when that will be. RPGs of any kind typically take a while to get through, and I'm still trying to track down the last 2 games in the series. So bear with me, as it might be a little while before we dive back into the Shadow Hearts universe. If you've enjoyed this video, please share it with your friends, leave a comment, subscribe, and all that other good stuff. Also, you can talk to me directly over on Twitter at Willem256. That's all for today. Thanks for watching, and take it easy.